They told me not to talk about what was on the recorder. They told me twice. Once in the room with the lawyers, and once in the parking lot afterwards, by a man who was not a lawyer and did not give his name. I signed the paper they put in front of me because my wife was pregnant with our second, and I had a mortgage, and I am not a brave man. I have kept my mouth shut for 11 years. I'm not going to keep it shut anymore, because the recorder is not the part that scares me. The part that scares me is what I heard before we ever opened the shark. My name is Cole Renfrew. I was 31 years old that summer. I worked as a museum preparator at a small natural history collection on the Gulf Coast, the kind of place that gets school field trips on weekdays and tourists with sunburn on weekends, and that runs on a budget so thin you can read a newspaper through it. My job was the bones and the skins and the wet specimens in the back. I cleaned skeletons. I mounted them on armatures I built myself out of brass rod and epoxy. I repaired old taxidermy. I rotated the formaldehyde jars in the wet collection so the labels would not fade against the glass. I had a degree in vertebrate biology from a state school and a second degree, of a kind, in being patient with dead things for long stretches of time. My wife used to say I had the temperament of a man who repairs church organs, which I think she meant kindly. I had been at the museum for almost 6 years when the call came in from a sport fishing charter about a half-mile off the South Jetty. The captain was a man we had worked with before, a retired commercial fisherman named Lon Pribble, who ran half-day trips for tourists and who had 2 summers earlier brought us a beautiful sailfish carcass that we still had on display in the lobby. He called the front desk on a Tuesday in late July. The receptionist patched him through to my workshop. He told me he had something I would want to see. He had hooked, fought, and finally killed, in shallow water on a wire leader, a tiger shark of unusual size. He said unusual in the careful way that older commercial men use the word, which meant he did not want to say a number over an open phone line, because he did not want to be wrong about it. He said it had taken him and his deckhand and one of his clients almost 3 hours. He said he had it lashed to the side of his boat, and he was making for the jetty very slowly because he did not want to lose it. He said he had photographed the head, and he did not like what he had seen in the photographs. He said he wanted somebody from the museum to come down and look at it before he had to decide what to do with it. He said he wanted me, specifically, because the last time he had brought us a fish, I had been respectful of it. I drove down to the marina with my supervisor, a woman named Dr. Inez Garza, who ran the collections department and who had hired me out of graduate school. She was in her early 60s and had spent most of her career on shark and ray morphology before she had taken the museum job to be closer to her grandchildren. She brought a measuring tape, a camera, and a small notebook. I brought a cooler of ice and a roll of contractor bags. We did not talk much on the drive. She was reading the photographs Lon had emailed her from his phone, on her phone, and she was making the small, careful sound in her throat that she made when she was looking at something she did not yet understand. I want to tell you about the shark before I tell you about anything else, because the shark is the thing that some part of me has never stopped looking at. It was 14 feet, 3 inches long. We measured it twice. It weighed somewhere over 1,000 pounds. We could not weigh it properly at the marina, but the harbor master's certified scale, which had a 1-ton capacity and which Lon hoisted it onto with a davit on the back of his boat, read 1,042 pounds and held there steadily while Dr. Garza took her photographs. That is not the part that mattered. Tiger sharks reach those sizes. They are not common at those sizes anymore, but they exist. What mattered was the head. The head was wrong in a way that took both of us several minutes to put into words. The eye on the port side was clouded with a heavy cataract, the kind you see on very old sharks, which was not by itself remarkable. What was remarkable was that the cataract was healed around the edges of an old scar that ran in a clean curve across the supraorbital ridge and down the side of the face, and that the scar was unmistakably the print of a steel cable. Not a single cut, a wrap. A long, deep groove of healed scar tissue that had clearly, at some point in the animal's life, been a piece of cable that had been wrapped around its head and that the animal had lived with for years afterward. The tissue around it had grown over the cable, then through it, then past it. The cable was gone, but the shape of it was still in the bone. The teeth were the second wrong thing. Tiger shark teeth replaced themselves throughout the animal's life, in conveyor belt fashion, with the older teeth in front falling out and new teeth rotating forward from behind. Most of the teeth in this shark's mouth were the right shape and size for the animal. The front row on the right side of the lower jaw were not. They were smaller. They were a different color. They were worn down in a flat shelf, the way a much older shark's teeth wear when the replacement rate has slowed past a certain age. Dr. Garza counted them 3 times. She told me, in the parking lot of the marina, with her hand on the side of the cooler, that she had only ever seen teeth like that in one previous specimen, on a museum mount in Australia, that had been aged at a documented 51 years. She said it quietly. She said, "This shark is at least 50. I did not say anything for a while. 50-year-old tiger sharks were not impossible. They were rare to the point of being almost folkloric, but they were not impossible. The shark in front of us was a real animal that we had measured and photographed, and that was, even then, beginning to smell the way large dead fish smell in July heat on a Gulf marina. Which is to say that all of our concerns about it were going to have to be addressed quickly. The third thing we found, we did not find until we got it back to the museum. We trucked the shark up the coast on a flatbed Dr. Garza borrowed from a friend at the State Fisheries Office. We put it on plastic sheeting on the floor of the loading bay behind the museum. The loading bay had its own roll-up door and a drain in the concrete and a hose for washing down, which was where we did all of our gross specimen work, because the smell did not belong inside the building. It was a little after 4 in the afternoon when we got it onto the sheeting. The sun was still high and hot. The bay door was open. 2 of our summer interns, both undergraduates, helped us position the body. And then Dr. Garza thanked them and sent them home for the day because she did not want them to see the necropsy. She and I worked alone, the way we always did on the big specimens. She made the first cut down the ventral midline with a long flensing knife she had owned since her graduate years, a knife she sharpened the way other people pray. She opened the abdominal cavity. We pulled the major organs out one at a time, weighed them on the Bay scale, photographed them, set them aside for fixation. We found the usual stomach contents of a tiger shark of that size, which is to say, nearly everything. Fish bones, a rubber boot, a piece of a license plate from a state that did not border the Gulf, a clump of seagrass, a turtle's plastron, a length of rope, the casing of a children's bicycle light, with the small clip still attached. Tiger sharks are sometimes called the garbage cans of the sea, and there are reasons for the name. It was Dr. Garza who found the phone. It was sitting deep in the cardiac portion of the stomach, in a dense, matted ball of softened plastic and partially digested fish, in a small pocket where it had clearly been resting for a long time. It was a cell phone of a model I had not seen in years. A flip phone, a clamshell, one of the small silver ones from the early 2000s, with a stubby black antenna at the top and a screen no larger than a postage stamp. It had clearly been in the shark for a while. The plastic case was eaten at the edges by gastric acid. The screen was scratched and pitted. small charm loop on the corner still had a frayed piece of pink lanyard hanging from it. We did not say anything for a long time. Dr. Garza set the phone, in its mat of stomach contents, into a stainless steel tray. She washed it gently with cold water and a soft brush. The plastic held. The hinge held. The small silver shell did not crack. When the matter was washed away, you could read, in a faded silver embossing on the front of the closed shell, a manufacturer's logo, and the small word, Verizon, underneath. She said, "That has been in there since before this phone was last manufactured." I said it could not have been. She said it could have been. She said tiger sharks of this size sometimes carried indigestible objects in the cardiac stomach for years. That there were documented cases of license plates and lobster traps and outboard motor parts found in animals whose movements suggested they had picked the objects up in entirely different waters years before. She said the phone might have been swallowed anywhere on the Gulf Rim, at any point since this model had been in use, and that it might have been resting in this animal for the better part of 2 decades. I picked it up with my gloved hand. It was heavier than I had expected, not by much, just enough to feel that there was still a battery inside. I turned it over. The back was scratched and discolored, but intact. The small camera lens on the back was intact. The hinge moved when I tested it. I opened the phone. It is hard to describe to you what I felt when I opened the phone. I want to be straight about it. I did not feel afraid. I felt the small, private thrill of a man who has been allowed to touch something old that nobody else has touched in a long time. It is the feeling that makes museum people what they are. I felt it that afternoon in the loading bay, with the smell of fish all around me and the Gulf light coming sideways through the open roll-up door. And I have thought about that feeling many times since, because it was the last clean feeling I had about the work for the rest of my life. The screen lit up. I do not mean that it flickered or that it ghosted. The small color screen lit up cleanly in the pale blue of an old menu interface and showed a low battery icon in the corner and a small icon in the middle of the screen that I did not recognize at first. The icon was a red dot. Underneath the red dot were the numbers of a counter. The counter was running. The numbers were ticking upward. I watched it for several seconds before I understood what it was. The phone was recording audio. It had been recording audio when it was swallowed. It was still recording audio. The counter, at the moment I opened the shell, read a number I will not give you because I do not want to be wrong about the digits, and I have tried not to lie to anyone about any part of this. I will tell you that the counter was a very large number. I will tell you that the counter, in the seconds while I held the phone open in my hand under the bay lights, kept advancing 1 digit at a time. The way the second hand on a clock advances, the way any audio recording counter advances on any phone you have ever held. Dr. Garza looked over my shoulder. She had her gloves off. She was holding her own phone in her hand, ready to take a photograph. She did not take the photograph. She stood with her own phone in her hand, and she looked at the small color screen of the dead shark's phone, and she watched the counter tick. She said, "That is not possible." I said, "No." She said, "The battery would be dead." I said, "Yes." She said, "The phone would have been crushed." I said, "Yes." She said, "The recording would have stopped when the storage filled." I said, "Yes." We stood there for a while. The counter kept ticking. The small red dot blinked in time with it, on and off, in the steady pulse that audio recording icons blink with on any device made in the last 25 years. I'm going to tell you what I did next, because it is the thing I should not have done, and because every other thing that happened afterward came out of it. I closed the phone. I did not press any other buttons. I did not stop the recording. I did not save any file. I closed the phone the way you would close a clamshell phone to put it in your pocket. And I set it in the stainless steel tray next to the rest of the stomach contents. And I peeled my gloves off. And I went to the slop sink to wash my hands. I closed it because I did not want it to be recording the room I was in. That is the truth. I had a feeling, watching the counter advance, that whatever the phone was doing, it was doing it now. And that I did not want my voice or Dr. Garza's voice to be on it. I had no good reason for the feeling. I had it anyway. I closed the phone to stop it from hearing us. I did not stop it. I only closed the shell. The counter, when I opened the phone again about an hour later, had not paused. It had kept ticking the whole time, inside the closed shell, in my tray, in my bay. I do not know what it was recording. I never found out. Dr. Garza, while I was at the sink, made a phone call from her own phone in the corner of the bay. She did not call the museum director. She did not call the local fish and wildlife office. She called a man she knew at a federal agency I had not previously heard her mention by name. She spoke to him for maybe 4 minutes. She did not raise her voice. When she came back to the tray, she said only that we were to leave the phone where it was, that we were to finish documenting the gross necropsy without referencing the phone in our notes, and that 2 people would be at the museum within the next 12 hours to take possession of the specimen. I said, "Take possession of which specimen?" She said, "Both. The shark and the phone." I said the shark was a museum specimen, and that Lon had brought it to us with the understanding that we would prepare it for display. She said she knew. She said that the situation had changed. She said that the agency she had called had standing arrangements with several museums on the Gulf Coast for the handling of unusual finds, and that this was one of those finds, and that the arrangement was going to be honored. She said it in a voice that did not invite further conversation. I had worked under her for 6 years. I had never heard that voice. I closed my mouth. We finished the necropsy at about 11 that night. We did not touch the phone again. We weighed and documented the other contents. We took skin samples. We took a tooth row sample for aging confirmation. We left the body on its sheeting under a clean tarp in the loading bay, with the bay door locked and the security system armed. Dr. Garza drove home. I drove home. My wife was already asleep when I came in. Our daughter, who was 4 then, had left a drawing of a fish on the kitchen table for me. I taped it to the front of the refrigerator. I ate a sandwich standing up over the sink. I did not sleep well. I was back at the museum at 6 in the morning. The trucks were already there. 2 unmarked white panel vans in the loading bay area with the engines running, and 4 people in dark blue coveralls without insignia, and a 5th man in a polo shirt and chinos with a clipboard who introduced himself only as Mr. Voss. They had a refrigerated transport container on a hand truck. They had a small foam-lined case for the phone. They had a signed letter from a federal agency I will not name because I was instructed not to name it, and which the people I'm still afraid of know perfectly well I could name if I wanted to, and which I'm not going to name because my 2nd child is in college now, and I would like her to finish. Mr. Voss was polite. He shook my hand. He shook Dr. Garza's hand. He thanked us for our discretion. He had me sign a non-disclosure agreement that ran to 9 pages in the loading bay on his clipboard, with a ballpoint pen he handed me from the inside pocket of his polo shirt. He waited for me to read it. I read it. It said in summary that I would not discuss the specimen, the contents of the specimen, any device recovered from the specimen, or any aspect of the recovery, with any person, agency, journalist, or family member in perpetuity. And that violation would be subject to penalties under several statutes that I had never heard of and that the document did not bother to explain. I signed it. Dr. Garza signed her own copy without reading it, which I noticed at the time and which I did not understand until much later. The men in coveralls loaded the shark into the refrigerated container. They were efficient. They worked the way people work when they have done a thing many times before. They wrapped the carcass in a heavy black plastic that was not the contractor plastic we had used. They sealed the seams of the wrapping with a heat gun. They lifted the wrapped body onto a sled and slid the sled into the container. They closed the container. They wheeled it out of the bay and into the back of the first panel van. The whole process took less than 20 minutes. While they were doing that, Mr. Voss himself took the phone. He lifted it out of the tray with a pair of clean gloves. He examined the screen for several seconds with no change of expression. The counter was still ticking. The red dot was still blinking. He set the phone gently into the foam-lined case. He closed the case. He locked the case with a small key he kept on a ring on his belt. He thanked me again. He thanked Dr. Garza. He got into the second van with the case on the seat beside him, and the small convoy pulled out of the loading bay. And the loading bay was empty. And the morning sun came in through the open door across the wet concrete where the shark had been. And there was nothing in the bay anymore, except the smell. Dr. Garza stood at the edge of the loading dock for a long time after the vans were gone. She did not look at me. After a while, she said, "You did the right thing closing the phone." I said I did not know what I'd done. She said, "Neither do I." She went back inside. That was the first day. I want to be honest about how I felt at the end of it, because the things I'm going to tell you about the days afterward only make sense if you understand the first day. I was uneasy. I was tired. I had a private feeling, the way a man does after he has signed a paper he did not fully understand, that I had given something away. I did not feel afraid. I did not feel that the phone, or the shark, or any part of what we had found, was going to follow me out of the loading bay. I went home that night, and I held my daughter, and I sat on the porch with my wife, and I drank a beer and watched the streetlights come on. I told her I had had a long day at work. I told her we had received a large specimen, and that the federal people had taken it for processing because of its size and condition. I told her the kind of small, clean lie that married people who work in unusual fields tell each other on porches in summer, and she accepted it the way she accepted other small, clean lies of that shape, with the understanding that I would tell her the truer version later when I had it. I never told her the truer version. I am telling it to her now, the way I am telling it to you, because I do not know any other way to tell it. The strange thing started about 3 weeks later. I want to walk you through them carefully because they did not arrive in the way that strange things arrive in stories. They arrived as small disturbances in the ordinary routine of a working museum, and each of them was the kind of thing that a tired man could explain away if he wanted to. And I wanted to. The first one was the voicemails. My desk phone at the museum had an old answering machine attached to it, because the museum's voicemail system had been broken for years, and the director had decided that an answering machine was cheaper than fixing it. It was the kind of cassette-based machine that you do not see anymore. I had inherited it from the previous preparador. The cassette in it was probably original to the machine. I had never bothered to change it. About 3 weeks after the necropsy, I came in on a Monday morning and the small red light on the answering machine was blinking. The machine read 3 new messages. I pressed play. The first message was a long beep, about 30 seconds, with no voice. The second message was a long beep, about 30 seconds, with no voice. The third message was a long beep, about 30 seconds, with no voice. I deleted them. I went about my morning. When I came back to my desk in the afternoon, the small red light was blinking again. 3 new messages. I pressed play. 3 long beeps, about 30 seconds each, no voice. I deleted them. I did not think much of it. We had had a problem with the telemarketing systems before. I told myself somebody had set up an auto dialer on a number that was hitting our line. The next morning, the small red light was blinking with 3 new messages, and the morning after that, 3 new messages, and the morning after that, 3 new messages. And they were all long beeps and all about 30 seconds, and all silent. I asked the receptionist if she'd been forwarding anything to my line. She said she had not. I asked her if anybody had been calling for me. She said no, that things had been quiet that week. I unplugged the answering machine from the wall on Thursday and stuck it in a drawer. The line still rang through to my office, but it would not record anymore. On Friday morning, when I came in, the answering machine in the drawer was blinking. The small red light was visible through the gap at the top of the drawer. I opened the drawer. The machine read 3 new messages. The machine was not plugged in. I sat at my desk for a long time, looking at the blinking light. I want to tell you what I felt then. I did not feel afraid. I felt the small, flat embarrassment that a practical man feels when he's being asked to believe something a practical man does not believe. I picked the machine up. I turned it over. The cord was wrapped around its body, plug in plain view, not attached to anything. The batteries in the back, which I had not known the machine even had, were a small set of 9-volt cells that had clearly been in the machine for years, and that, when I pulled the cover, I could see were heavily corroded. The kind of corrosion that does not produce current. I checked the cells with a small voltmeter from the prep room. They were dead. They had no voltage. The machine had no power source. The red light was blinking. I pressed play. The cassette spun. 3 long beeps, about 30 seconds each, no voice. The third one, just before it cut off, had the smallest sound under the beep. A sound I would not have caught if I'd not been listening for something. It was the sound of a hand moving against a small piece of cloth. The way you sometimes hear when you have a cell phone in a pocket and the microphone is rubbing against the lining. A small, soft scraping sound. Almost nothing. Then the beep cut off. I took the cassette out. I put it in my pocket. I left the machine in the drawer. I closed the drawer. I went home that night, and I did not tell my wife about the cassette. The second strange thing happened a few days later, in the wet collection. The wet collection was a long, narrow room in the basement, with shelving units running floor to ceiling along both walls, and glass jars of preserved specimens lined up on the shelves in rows, and a small drain in the center of the floor for the day when one of them inevitably broke. I went down there once a week to check the seal on the larger jars and to rotate them so the labels did not bleach. I was halfway through my rotations on the second Wednesday of August when I noticed that one of the jars on the upper shelf, a small jar containing the preserved heart of a young bull shark from a research project years before my time, had a smudge on the inside of the glass that I did not remember from the previous week. I climbed the rolling ladder. I looked at the jar. The smudge was on the inside. The smudge was the shape of a fingerprint. It was pressed against the glass from inside the jar, in the alcohol, on the surface of the preserved heart. The heart did not have any fingers. The heart was a heart. It did not have hands. I told myself it was a trick of the light. I climbed down. I made a note in the inventory book to inspect the seal on that jar on my next rotation. I did not climb back up to look at the smudge again. I went back upstairs. Dr. Garza had taken the rest of August off. She had told me, on the Monday after the federal people had come, that she had some family business to attend to with one of her grandchildren, and that she would be back at the museum after Labor Day. She had not given me a phone number. She had not given me an email. She had told me, in the corridor between our offices, with her hand briefly on my shoulder, that I should not worry about the loading bay, and that I should not worry about the cassette in my pocket, and that I should not worry about whatever else came up in the next few weeks, because she had been through this kind of thing once before in her career, and she would talk to me about it when she was back. She had said, this kind of thing. I had wanted to ask her what kind of thing she meant. I had not asked. I had let her go. She did not come back after Labor Day. The first week of September passed. The second week passed. The director told me, in a meeting on a Thursday in late September, that Dr. Garza had decided to take an early retirement, effective immediately, for personal reasons, and that the museum would be advertising her position in the spring, and that in the meantime, I would be acting collections supervisor with a small pay bump. He said it the way you say a thing that has already been decided above your head. He did not look me in the eye. He shook my hand. He went back to his office. I called the cell phone number I had for Dr. Garza that night, from my home line, after my wife and daughter had gone to bed. The number was out of service. I called the museum's emergency contact line for her, which she had given to the front desk years ago for use in case anything went wrong with the wet collection. The number rang 4 times. A woman answered. She was not Dr. Garza. She was younger. She did not give her name. She said hello, and she waited. I said I was looking for Dr. Garza. She said, I am sorry, this is not her number anymore. I said, this is the number she gave the museum for emergencies. She was quiet for a second. Then she said, Sir, this is not her number anymore. She said it with a small, careful precision that you use when you are reading something off a card. She said it again. This is not her number anymore. She did not say anything else. She waited for me to hang up. I hung up. I stood in my kitchen for a long time. I went out onto my porch. I sat in the chair. The crickets were loud. The streetlight at the end of my driveway had the small ring of moths around it that it always had in late summer. My neighbor's dog barked twice and went quiet. I sat there and I thought about the smudge on the inside of the jar, and the blinking light on the unplugged machine, and the woman on the phone reading her line. And I thought about Dr. Garza saying, this kind of thing, with her hand on my shoulder in the corridor. And I thought about the small silver flip phone, with its counter ticking up inside its sealed foam case, in the back of a van I was never going to see again. I thought about the shark too. I thought about the cable scar on its head and the worn-down old teeth and the 50 years of life it had carried around in the Gulf before it ended up on Lon Pribble's deck. I thought about what a 50-year-old animal might have heard over the course of those 50 years, swimming with a small recording device that could not, by any law of physics I had been taught, still be powered. I went back into the house. I went into my daughter's room. She was asleep on her side, with her hand under her cheek, the way she always slept. I stood in the doorway and watched her breathe for a minute. I have done that many times since, in many doorways, with both of my children. I think it is the one habit I've kept from that summer that I am not ashamed of. I went to bed. I did not sleep. The first week of October, the museum received a package addressed to me by name. It was a small padded mailer with no return address, postmarked from a city about 300 miles up the coast. The receptionist set it on my desk in the afternoon. I opened it after she'd gone home. Inside the mailer was a small clamshell phone A silver one, older model. The same model as the one we had taken out of the shark. The plastic was scratched and pitted. The small charm loop on the corner had a frayed piece of pink lanyard hanging from it. There was no note in the mailer. There was nothing else in the mailer. The phone was closed. I did not open it for a long time. I sat at my desk with the door of my office shut, and I held the closed phone in my hand, and I watched my office window slowly go from late afternoon gold to evening gray to the dim blue of the security lights coming on in the parking lot outside. I opened it. The screen lit up. The small color menu came on. In the middle of the screen was a red dot. Under the red dot was a counter. The counter was running. The numbers were ticking upward. The number on the counter, when I opened the phone, was the same number that had been on the counter of the original phone in the stainless steel tray in my loading bay 11 weeks before. It had not started over. It had continued. It was, by the look of it, exactly where the other one had left off, plus the additional weeks that had passed in the meantime, in seconds. I closed the phone. I did not press anything else. I sat at my desk. The phone sat on the blotter in front of me. The small silver shell was warm in a way that small silver shells are not warm. The warmth was the warmth of a small device that has been running on its own power for a very long time. I put my hand on it. I felt the warmth. I lifted my hand. The warmth stayed. The phone in the loading bay had been in the shark for almost 20 years. The phone on my desk had been mailed to me from 300 miles away by somebody who knew my name and my office number, and who had not signed the package. The two phones had the same scratch pattern, the same pink lanyard, the same counter. They were the same phone, except that one of them was inside a sealed foam case in the back of a panel van belonging to an agency I was not allowed to name. And the other one was sitting on my desk, in my closed office, in a small coastal museum in October, in the dark. Somebody, somewhere, wanted me to know that the phone had not stayed where the men in coveralls had taken it. Somebody wanted me to know that I had not been allowed to walk away from the loading bay on that summer morning by closing a shell and signing a paper. Somebody had decided that I, specifically, was going to keep listening, whether I wanted to or not. I sat at my desk for a long time. The phone sat on the blotter. The small red light of I drove home with the phone in the inside pocket of my jacket, and I did not open it again that night. I parked at the end of my street, and I walked the last block on foot, because I wanted to see my house from a distance, before I went inside, in a way I had never wanted to see it before. The porch light was on. The kitchen light was on. Through the kitchen window I could see my wife at the sink, with our daughter on a chair next to her, both of them washing something I could not see from the street. They looked the way they had always looked. I stood at the end of the block, and I watched them for maybe 2 minutes, and the phone against my chest was warm the whole time. And at the end of those 2 minutes, I went inside, and I took the phone out of my jacket, and I put it in the locked drawer of my desk in the back room where I did my woodwork. And I went to the kitchen, and I helped them dry dishes, and I did not say anything about anything. I am telling you that because I want you to understand the shape of the choice I had already started to make. The men in the coveralls had taken the first phone. Somebody had sent me a second one. I had not driven that second phone to a police station. I had not called the number on the back of the non-disclosure agreement. I had taken it home, and I had put it in a drawer in the house where my wife and my daughter slept. And I had told myself I was going to think about what to do in the morning. That is the first move in this part of the story that I will not be able to defend to you. I am not going to try. The phone stayed in the drawer for 3 days. I checked it twice a day. It was always closed. It was always warm. I I do not know how I knew it was warm without opening it. But I always knew. The drawer itself was warm. The wood around the drawer was warm. The small brass key I kept the drawer locked with was warm in my pocket when I touched it through the cloth. On the fourth day, which was a Saturday, I drove to a hardware store about 40 minutes inland, and I bought a small fire safe, the kind people keep tax documents in. I paid cash. I drove home. I put the phone in the safe. I put the safe under the workbench in the back room, behind a stack of plywood offcuts I had been meaning to throw away for 2 years. My wife came back into the back room while I was finishing, with a cup of coffee for me, and she asked me what the safe was for, and I told her I had bought it for some old paperwork from my parents' estate, and she nodded, and she set the coffee on the bench, and she went back out. She believed me. She had no reason not to. That was the second move. The voicemails on my desk phone stopped that week. I had unplugged the answering machine and shoved it in a drawer and forgotten about it, and when I checked the drawer on the Monday after the safe, the small red light was no longer blinking. The machine was simply dead in its drawer the way an unplugged machine should be. I left it there. I did not test it. I told myself that whatever had been calling the line had decided it was done with me. I did not believe myself. I left the machine in the drawer because I did not want to find out otherwise. The phone on my desk, the museum desk phone, kept ringing during the day, but the calls were ordinary calls. School groups wanting to book tours, a donor checking on a plaque, a vendor confirming the next month's order of formaldehyde and tag wire. Ordinary museum life. I answered them and I made the notes I always made, and I returned to the work that had piled up while Dr. Garza had been gone, and I let myself believe, for hours at a time, that the part of my life that had begun on Lon Pribble's boat in late July was over. That the men in coveralls had taken what they had come to take. That the package had been a strange, one-time gesture by somebody I would never meet. And that the worst thing that was going to happen to me as a result of any of it was that I would have a small fire safe under my workbench for the rest of my life. I want to be careful with the next part. I'm going to tell you about the calls that came to my home phone, and I'm going to do it slowly, because the calls are what changed what kind of story this was. They did not start as anything dramatic. They started the way the voicemails had started at the museum and say silence on a line. The first one came on a Tuesday in mid-October. It was just after 8 in the evening. My daughter was watching a cartoon in the living room. My wife was in the bathroom running a bath. I was at the kitchen table going through a stack of bills. The phone rang. I picked it up. There was nobody there. I said hello twice. I waited. I heard faintly what could have been a bad connection, the soft hiss of an open line. Underneath the hiss, I heard the small, soft scraping sound I had heard at the end of the third voicemail on the cassette in my pocket weeks before. The sound of cloth moving against a microphone. The sound of a phone in a pocket. The sound carried for maybe 3 seconds, and then the line cut. I hung up. I sat at the table. I did not say anything to my wife when she came out of the bathroom in her robe with her hair up. I did not say anything to my daughter when I put her to bed an hour later. The phone rang again the next night at almost the same time. I picked it up. The same hiss. The same small, soft scraping under it. The same 3 seconds. The same cut. The third night, it rang at 8 again. I let my wife answer it. She picked up. She said hello. She said hello again. She said, "Is somebody there?" She listened for a moment. She said, "I think there is a problem with the line." She hung up. She said to me, "You know, that is the third night in a row." I told her it was probably a telemarketer with a misconfigured auto dialer. I told her it would stop in a few days. She made a face that meant she did not entirely believe me, but that she was not interested in arguing about it. She went back to what she had been doing. The phone rang at 8 on the 4th night, the 5th night, the 6th night. I started picking it up first when I could. I started keeping a small notebook on the table next to the phone. I wrote down the time of each call. I wrote down the duration. I wrote down what I heard. The duration was always almost exactly 28 seconds. The hiss was always the same hiss. The small, soft scraping was always there, somewhere in the middle, and the cut at the end was always clean. On the 8th night, I heard a voice. It was very faint. It was at the very end of the call, just before the cut, in the bottom of the hiss. It was a man's voice. It was speaking a single word, which I could not make out at first. The word had 2 syllables. It had the shape of a name. I played the recording in my head for an hour after the call ended, sitting on the porch in the cold, trying to fit names to the shape of it. I could not. I went to bed. On the 9th night, the voice was clearer. It was still a man's voice. The 2-syllable shape was still there. The first syllable was hard, a kind of clipped consonant. The second syllable was open, a kind of long vowel. I sat at the table after I hung up and I wrote the syllables out phonetically in the notebook, and I looked at what I had written, and I felt the small, cold thing that you feel when a piece of a puzzle goes into place in the middle of the night. The shape of the word was my name, Cole. The voice on the phone was saying my name. I did not tell my wife. I did not tell anyone. I sat on this for 2 more nights, while the calls kept coming at 8, while the voice in the hiss kept saying my name a little more clearly, while the small, soft scraping under the hiss kept reminding me of the phone in the safe in the back room, the phone in the foam case in the back of the van, the phone in the stomach of a 50-year-old shark. I sat on it, and I tried to think about what to do. I want to tell you something now about Dr. Garza that I did not know at the time and that I learned later. I am going to tell you because the rest of the story will not make sense if I do not. I learned it from a former colleague of hers, a man named Henrik Alto, who had worked with her at a different institution in the 1990s, and whom I tracked down by going through her old publications and finding his name on 3 of her co-authored papers, and looking him up at the university where he had retired. I called him from a payphone outside a gas station on a back road in November, because by November I had begun to assume that my home line and my office line were both being listened to, and because I did not want anybody to hear what I was about to ask him. I told him who I was. I told him I had worked under Dr. Garza for 6 years. I told him that something had come up at our museum the previous summer that I needed to ask him about, and that I understood if he could not talk about it, but that I was asking anyway. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "Son, I am 81 years old, and the people who could hurt me for telling you anything have mostly forgotten I exist." He said, "Ask your question." I told him about the shark. I told him about the phone. I told him about the men in coveralls. I told him about Dr. Garza's early retirement and the disconnected number and the woman on the emergency line who had been reading from a card. I did not tell him about the second phone or the calls. I wanted to know what he knew before I gave him what I had. He listened. He did not interrupt. When I was done, he said, "That is the 3rd one I have heard of." I asked him what he meant. He said that in the late 1980s, Dr. Garza had been part of a small, informal network of marine biologists on 3 continents who had been collecting reports of unusual recoveries from large pelagic sharks, mostly tigers and bulls, and the occasional great white. He said the reports had not been about the animals themselves, but about objects found inside them. He said the objects had always been recording devices of some kind. He said the first one he had personally seen had been a small reel-to-reel tape recorder, military issue, of a make he did not recognize, recovered from the stomach of a tiger shark caught off Madagascar in 1986, with a tape still in it that was running when the animal was opened. He said the second one he had personally heard of, from Dr. Garza, had been a small handheld dictaphone recovered from a bull shark in the Sea of Cortez in 1991, which had also been running when the animal was opened. I said, "Running." He said, "Yes." I said, "The batteries." He said, "Yes." He said he had asked the same question. He said Dr. Garza had told him on a long-distance phone call in the early 90s that there was no battery answer to that question, and that there had not been one in the case of the reel-to-reel from Madagascar either, and that the people who had taken those specimens had not given any answer to that question, and that the people who had taken those specimens had been the same people, more or less, who had come to take ours. He did not name them. I did not ask. He said the network of biologists had gradually stopped talking to each other about it over the course of the 1990s, because every time one of them had tried to publish something about it, the data had vanished and the funding had vanished, and a polite man in a polo shirt had come to visit them and explain that this was not a field that anybody was going to be allowed to work in. He said Dr. Garza had been one of the few who had kept her own private notes. He said he did not know what had become of those notes after she had retired. I asked him what he thought was going on. He said he did not know. He said he had a guess, but that he had stopped trusting his guesses about the world many years ago, and that he would not give me his guess over a phone line. He said he could tell me only what he had been told by an older colleague when he had first heard about the recovery from Madagascar, which was that the recordings were not blank, and that the people who were taking them were not destroying them, and that whoever they were sending them to had been listening to them for a long time. He said that. He said, "Somebody has been listening for a long time." I drove home from the gas station that night with my hands tight on the wheel and the heater on too high. I went into the back room when I got home, and I opened the safe, and I took out the second phone. I held it in my hand for a long time. I did not open the shell. I held it closed. I want to tell you what I felt then. I do not have a clean word for it. I am going to use the closest word I have, even though it is not exactly right. I felt watched. I felt that the small, warm clamshell in my hand was a small, open eye, and that the eye was not looking at me with any particular intent, the way a person's eye looks at you, but the way a security camera on a ceiling looks at you, which is to say that it was simply recording, and that whatever it recorded was going somewhere else, to be looked at by something I was not going to meet. I closed my hand around the phone. I put it back in the safe. I locked the safe. I went into the bedroom. My wife was already in bed. She was awake, reading. She looked up at me when I came in. She set the book down on her chest. She said, "What is going on with you?" I said it was a long day. She said, "You have been having a lot of long days." She said it the way she said things she had been waiting to say. She said, "Your daughter asked me yesterday if you were angry at her." She said it carefully. She was not accusing me. She was telling me what was happening in the house I was supposed to be in. I sat on the edge of the bed, and I put my hand on her foot through the blanket. I told her I was sorry. I told her I had been distracted by something at work. I told her I would work through it. She watched my face for a long moment. Then she picked her book back up. She said, "All right, Cole." She said it in a voice that meant she was going to give me until Christmas, and that after Christmas we were going to have a different conversation, and that I should plan accordingly. She said my name the way the voice on the phone had said it, not in the same shape exactly, but close enough that I felt it. The calls kept coming. The voice kept saying my name. It said my name on a Friday night, slowly and clearly, in the small, soft hiss of the open line. And then it said something else after my name. It said a second word. The second word was, please. The voice was a man's voice. The voice was steady and quiet, the way a tired man's voice is when he's been asking for something for a long time. It said, Cole, please. I hung up. I sat at the kitchen table. My wife was at her sister's that night with our daughter. The house was empty. The kitchen light was on. The refrigerator hummed. I sat at the table for a long time with my hand on the receiver, and I tried to think about who I had ever known in my life, whose voice that might have been. I had a father who had died when I was 19. I had an older brother who had moved to another country and who I had not spoken to in 4 years because of a fight neither of us could remember the details of. I had had friends who had drifted away after college, the way friends do. I had had a roommate in graduate school who had drowned in a river the summer before I started my doctorate. I went through all of them in my head. The voice did not belong to any of them. It belonged to a man I did not know. I made a decision that night. It was a small decision. It was not a brave decision. I tell you now, looking back, that it was the worst decision of my life. Although I did not know it at the time, and although I'm not entirely sure even now that any of the other decisions available to me would have been better. I decided I was going to listen. I went into the back room. I opened the safe. I took the phone out. I sat down on the floor of the back room with my back against the workbench, and I held the phone in both hands, and I opened the shell. The screen lit up. The small red dot blinked. The counter ticked. I looked at the small menu options at the bottom of the screen. I navigated with the small, worn directional pad to the audio file list. There was one file in the list. It had been recording, as far as I could tell, continuously for almost 20 years. I selected it. I pressed play. I am not going to tell you what was on the recording. I want to be very clear about that. It is not because I'm being coy with you. It is because there are still people in my life who could be hurt if I described what I heard. And because the people who took the first phone gave me a list of things I was not allowed to discuss in any forum. And the contents of that recording were on that list, even though they did not know, when they wrote the list, that I had heard any part of any version of it. I will tell you only the shape of what I heard. I heard a long, slow, ordinary stretch of underwater sound. The kind of sound you get when a microphone is inside a closed space inside the body of a large animal, full of the small, wet rumbles and pulses of a circulatory system at work. I heard that sound for a long time. I scrubbed forward through it on the small directional pad. I heard, underneath the rumbles and pulses, a voice. The voice was the voice that had been saying my name on my home line. The voice was talking, quietly, in long stretches, with long pauses, in a way that suggested it was talking to itself, or to somebody it could not hear back from. The voice was not muffled by water. The voice was clear. The voice did not belong inside a shark. The voice was, somehow, inside the recording, layered into the wet sounds of the animal, the way 2 channels are layered on a tape. The voice was reading names. It was not reading my name. It was reading other names. Long lists of them. Slow, careful, evenly spaced, with a small pause after each one, the way a teacher reads a roll on the first day of school. The names were not names I recognized. They were the names of strangers. There were thousands of them. The voice read them in the order somebody had given them to it, and at certain points in the list, it would pause for longer and clear its throat softly and continue. I listened to the names for almost 40 minutes before I made myself stop. I had begun, in that 40 minutes, to recognize a pattern in the kinds of names being read, which I'm also not going to share with you, because it would tell you what kind of people the voice was reading. And that is one of the things I am not allowed to describe. I will tell you only that the names had something in common. I will tell you only that I understood, listening to them, that the voice was reading a list that had been compiled by somebody, and that the list was not finished, and that the voice had been reading it for a long time, and that the voice was going to keep reading it until the list was finished, however long that took. After the names, my name came up. It was not at the end. It was somewhere in the middle. The voice read my full name, Cole Renfrew, in the same, even careful way it had read the other names. It read my name, and it paused, and it cleared its throat softly, and it kept going. It read more names after mine. Then it stopped reading names for a stretch, and it began to speak in long sentences again, in the same quiet voice that had said please on my home line. And it said things about me. It said the name of the museum I worked at. It said the name of the street I lived on. It said the name of my wife. It said the name of our daughter. It said the name of the small daycare she went to on Tuesdays and Thursdays. It said the name of the doctor my wife had been seeing about the pregnancy with our second. That last one I had not told anyone yet. My wife had told her sister. Her sister had told nobody. The pregnancy was 8 weeks old. We had not told my mother. We had not told the museum. The voice on the recording, which had been in a shark for 20 years and which was now in a phone in my back room, knew the name of the doctor my wife had seen the week before. I closed the phone. I put it back in the safe. I closed the safe. I locked the safe. I sat on the floor of the back room with my back against the workbench and my hands on my knees, and I waited for my breathing to slow. The phone rang in the kitchen. I did not answer it. The next morning, I drove to a different gas station on a different back road, and I called Mr. Voss at the number on the back of the non-disclosure agreement. I had carried the agreement folded into the inside pocket of my wallet since July. I had not unfolded it once. I unfolded it that morning, leaning against my car at the edge of the gas station lot, and I read the small number printed in tight letters at the bottom of the last page, and I dialed it from the payphone with quarters I had counted out of the change cup in my car. The number rang twice. A woman's voice answered. She did not give her name. She said, "Identification." I read her the small alphanumeric string at the top of the agreement. She was silent for a moment. Then she said, "Please hold." She put me on hold. There was no music. There was only a soft, even hiss. I listened to the hiss for almost 3 minutes. Under the hiss, very faintly, I could hear the small, soft scraping sound that I had heard on every other line in this story. Mr. Voss came on. He sounded the way he had sounded in the loading bay. Polite, efficient, not surprised to hear from me. He said, "Mr. Renfrew." I told him I needed to talk to him about a delivery I had received at the museum. He said, "All right." I told him that something had come through the mail in early October, addressed to me, and that I had reason to believe it was related to the specimen he had collected over the summer, and that I had not opened it for a long time, but that I'd now opened it, and that I needed help. He listened. When I was done, he said, "Where is the item now?" I told him it was in a small fire safe under a workbench in the back room of my house, and that I had locked the safe, and that I had not touched the item since the previous night. He said, "Do not touch it again." He said it gently. He said somebody would be at my house within 4 hours. He said I should not tell my wife or my daughter that anybody was coming. He said I should be at the house when they arrived. He said I should not, under any circumstance, play the recording for anyone, including myself, between now and then. I told him I'd already played part of it. There was a long pause on his end. He said, "How much?" I said, "About 40 minutes." He said, "All right." He said, "Did you hear your own name?" I said, "Yes." He said, "All right." He said it again. He said somebody would be at my house in 4 hours. He hung up. I drove home. My wife was at work. My daughter was at the daycare. The house was empty. I sat in the back room with the safe on the floor in front of me, and I waited. 3 hours and 40 minutes after I had hung up the phone at the gas station, 2 men in dark blue coveralls came down my driveway in an unmarked white panel van. They were not the same men who had come to the museum. They had with them a small foam-lined case. They were polite. They shook my hand. They did not give their names. The older of the 2 told me that Mr. Voss had asked him to thank me for calling. He told me that the item in the safe was going to be removed, and that the safe itself was going to be removed, and that the contents of the back room would be inspected. He asked me if I had touched the item with my bare hands. I told him I had been wearing my work gloves the night before. He asked me where the gloves were. I gave them to him. He put them in a small plastic bag. While the younger one was inspecting the back room, the older one sat me down at my kitchen table. He had a folder with him. He set the folder on the table between us. He opened it. Inside the folder was a single sheet of paper. He turned it around and slid it across to me. It was a form. It was a 1-page form with the seal of an agency I will not name at the top, and 3 short paragraphs of legal language in the body, and a signature line at the bottom. He told me that the form, if I signed it, would enroll me in a relocation and protection arrangement that the agency operated for individuals in circumstances similar to mine. He told me that the arrangement would include the relocation of myself and my immediate family to a different state, under different names, within 48 hours, with full financial support during the transition, with new employment arranged in my field, with a small house in a small town, with a school enrollment for my daughter, with health coverage for my wife's pregnancy. He told me that the arrangement would also include the discontinuation of all contact with anyone I currently knew, including my brother and my mother, and the man I had called from the gas station 2 days earlier, whose phone the agency was already monitoring. He told me that the arrangement was permanent, and that the new identity would be the only identity I or my family would ever use again. He told me, with a small, careful gentleness that I have not been able to forget, that the alternative to signing the form was that the calls would continue, and that the voice on the recording would continue to read names, and that the list the voice was reading from was a list that the agency had been tracking for many years, and that being on the list was a thing that the agency had not yet found any other way to protect a person from. He told me he was very sorry. He told me he knew it was a lot to ask. He told me that the offer required, as a condition, that I leave behind certain people, specifically people I had not yet told about the pregnancy, and people I had grown up with, and any person who might be reasonably expected to look for me if I disappeared. He did not list them. He said I would know who they were. He said the relocation would be cleaner if I made the list myself, in advance, and gave it to him in writing. He waited. I sat at my own kitchen table in the house I had bought with my wife 6 years before, and I looked at the form, and I thought about the voice reading my daughter's daycare on a recording that had been inside a 50-year-old animal in the Gulf. And I thought about my mother, who lived alone in the small house I had grown up in, 3 hours up the coast, and who would not understand. I thought about my brother in the country we had not spoken across in 4 years. I thought about Lon Pribble, who had brought us the shark, and who I had spoken to twice since July, to thank him and to ask after his health, and who would not understand either. I thought about the friends my wife had kept since college, the women who came over on weekends and who had thrown her a baby shower for our daughter, and who had not been told about this baby yet because we had been waiting for the 12-week mark. I thought about all of them. I tried to think about what the right thing to do was. I could not find it. There was no shape in my head that fit the word right. There was only the shape of the form on the table and the shape of the safe in the back room and the shape of my wife's belly, which had not yet begun to show. I signed the form. I did not write down the names of the people I was leaving behind. I told the man that I would do it on the drive, that I needed time. He nodded. He said that was fine. He took the form. He folded it back into the folder. He shook my hand again. He told me a car would come for my family at 4 the next morning. He and the younger man took the safe. They took the gloves. They took the cassette I had kept in my desk drawer at the museum, which I went down to the museum that afternoon and gave to them in the parking lot, because the older man asked me for it on the way out, and I did not see any point in lying about it. They took the answering machine from the drawer in my office. They took the notebook from my kitchen counter where I had been writing down the times and durations of the calls. They were thorough. They were quiet. By dinner time, my house looked the way it had always looked, except that the back room was missing a small fire safe and a stack of plywood offcuts I had been meaning to throw away for 2 years. That night, I sat my wife down at the kitchen table after our daughter had gone to bed, and I told her, in the smallest and clearest words I had, that we were leaving in the morning, that the museum had become a situation I could not stay in, that the federal people were helping us relocate, that we would be in a different state by the next afternoon, that we would be using different names. I told her I could not tell her why. I told her I was sorry. I told her I understood if she wanted to take our daughter and go to her sister's that night instead, and that the men had told me she had that option and that they would respect it. She looked at me for a long time across the table. She did not cry. She had never been a crier. She asked me quietly whether anybody was going to hurt our daughter. I said no. She asked me whether anybody was going to hurt the baby. I said no. She asked me whether anybody was going to hurt her. I said no. She asked me whether anybody was going to hurt me. I did not answer that one quickly enough. And she saw the answer in my face, and she nodded, and she said, "All right." She said, "We are going with you, Banderai." I have spent 11 years thinking about that sentence. I have spent 11 years thinking about whether she said it because she loved me, or because she was protecting our daughter, or because she did not yet understand what she was agreeing to, or because she was simply too tired that night to imagine an alternative. I think the answer is that all of those were true at the same time, and that she said it the way people say the most important sentences of their lives, which is to say, without entirely meaning to. We were in the car at 4 in the morning. My daughter was asleep in the back, in a small nest of blankets, with her stuffed elephant under her arm. My wife sat next to me in the front. The driver did not speak to us. The car was unmarked and very clean. We drove for 14 hours. We slept in a hotel I will not name. The next day we drove for 8 more. By the second evening, we were in a small town in a state I had never lived in a small house at the end of a quiet street, with the keys on the kitchen counter and a folder of new documents on the table. and a small handwritten note from the older man saying that someone would check in by phone in 3 days, and that the phone in the new house had been swept and was clean, and that we should rest. We rested. My daughter went to her new school under her new name. My wife had the baby in the spring, a boy, in a small hospital in our new town, under our new last name. I took a job at a different museum, smaller than the first one, that the agency had arranged through channels I never asked about. I learned to answer to my new first name. I learned to answer the phone with my new last name. My wife learned to be a woman she had not been before. We did not talk about any of it. The voice never came back. I want to be careful about that part, because it is the part that has cost me the most. The phone in the new house has never rung the way the phone in the old house rang. The voicemail system has never blinked when it should not have blinked. The desk phone at my new museum has never developed a habit of recording silent 30-second messages. The agency has, by every measurable sign, done what it said it would do. We are safe. We have been safe for 11 years. My mother died 4 years ago. She died in the small house I had grown up in, 3 hours up a coast I had not seen in 7 years. She died alone. She had been told by the agency, in the second week after we had left, that I had taken a research position abroad and that I was not allowed to be in contact for security reasons. She had believed them for a long time. In her last years, I'm told, she had stopped believing them. I am told this by a woman named Henna, who had been my mother's neighbor for 30 years, and who tracked the agency down after my mother's death, and who was given a phone number that I was allowed, under specific conditions, to call her from. I called her from a hotel in a city neither of us lived in. She was old. She was kind. She told me what my mother had said in her last weeks. I am not going to tell you what she said. I will tell you only that my mother had not believed I was abroad. She had believed, by the end, that I had been killed. She had believed it because she had decided that no son she had raised would have left her alone for that long if he was alive. I did not go to her funeral. The agency would not allow it. My brother, in the country we had not been speaking across, was told the same story about the research position. He believed it. He still believes it. He has stopped trying to reach me. He has, the last I was told, a wife and a son of his own. I do not know their names. I will not know them. Lon Pribble died of a heart attack 2 summers after the shark. I was told this by Mr. Voss on a call from a number that did not allow me to call back. He told me Lon had been on a charter trip at the time. He told me there had been no foul play. He told me he was sorry. I believed him. I have no reason not to. Lon had been 74 years old and a heavy man and a smoker, and had not, I think, been afraid of dying on the water. I am glad he died on the water. I do not think he would have liked to die anywhere else. My wife and I had a 3rd child 6 years ago, a girl. She does not know any of this. None of my children know any of this. My daughter, who is 15 now, and who was 4 the summer the shark came to our museum, sometimes asks me about the place we used to live, the way teenagers sometimes ask about the early parts of their lives. I tell her what I'm allowed to tell her. I tell her about the porch we had, and the streetlight at the end of the driveway, and the way her mother used to wash the dishes with her after dinner. I do not tell her her old name. I do not tell her my old name. She has stopped asking, in the last year or so, what we used to be called. I do not know if she has figured out that there was a before, or if she has only sensed that the question makes me quiet. I work at the new museum 5 days a week. I clean bones. I mount armatures. I rotate jars in the wet collection. The wet collection at the new museum is smaller than the one at the old one, and brighter and easier to keep clean. There are no jars in it with smudges on the inside of the glass. The basement is dry. The drains work. The phone in my office is a digital phone with no answering machine attached, because the museum's voicemail system has been working for years and there is no need. I have not been on a boat since the summer of the shark. I have not eaten fish since the summer of the shark. I cannot tell you exactly why that second one. My wife respects it. My children think I'm allergic. The recording is still being made. I want you to understand that. I do not know where the phone is. I do not know whether it is still in the foam-lined case in the back of a van, or in a vault in a building I will never see, or in a drawer in some other man's house. I know only that the counter, when I last looked at it, was advancing 1 second at a time, and that I have no reason to believe that anything has changed about it since. Somewhere, in some quiet room, a voice is reading names. My name has already been read. It has been read once in a list. It has not been read a second time. I do not know what happens when a name is read a second time. I do not know whether such a thing has ever happened. I do not want to know. I want to tell you the part of this that I think about most, when the older man sat across from me at my kitchen table 11 years ago and slid the form across to me. He told me that the offer required me to leave certain people behind. He did not tell me to make the list of those people on a piece of paper. He told me to make the list in my head. He told me I would know who they were. I sat at the table, and I thought about my mother and my brother and my friends and Lon and the women in my wife's life and the doctor we had been seeing for the pregnancy. And I made the list in my head, and I signed the form, and I gave my agreement to the arrangement. I have come to understand, in the years since, that the list I made in my head that afternoon was the second list of names I'd been part of that year. The first list was the one the voice was reading on the recording. The second list was the one I made in my own kitchen, in my own head, of the people I was willing to disappear from in order to keep my wife and my daughter and my unborn son alive. The voice on the recording read names that somebody, somewhere, had assigned to it. I read mine to myself. I have not been able, since, to entirely separate the two acts in my head. I have not been able to convince myself that the list I made was a different kind of list than the list the voice was reading. They were both lists of people whose lives had been narrowed by a decision made elsewhere into something smaller than they had been. My mother was on my list. She died alone in the house I grew up in because I put her on a list at my kitchen table on a Wednesday night in October 11 years ago in order to save the people I had chosen to keep. That is the part I am not going to make smaller for you. I am not going to tell you that I did the right thing, because I do not know if I did. I'm not going to tell you that I had no choice, because I had one. And the choice I made was the one that kept my wife and my children alive. And I would make it again. And that is the worst thing I will ever say about myself. The phone in my new museum office rang this afternoon while I was finishing a brass armature for a juvenile sea turtle that the marine lab up the road had donated. It was a vendor confirming an order of formaldehyde. I took the call. I made the note. I hung up. I went back to my work. I bent the brass rod the way I've bent it for almost 20 years. I fitted it under the small vertebrae. I held the spine in place with my left hand while my right hand reached for the epoxy. For a moment, with the small dry weight of the bones in my palm, I thought about the shark. I thought about the cable scar on its head and the worn-down teeth and the 50 years of life it had carried around in the Gulf before it ended up on Lon's deck. I thought about a 50-year-old animal swimming the same water for half a century with a recording device in its stomach that did not run on any battery I understood. I thought about what that animal had been, in the end. I thought about whether it had known. I thought about whether it had been a shark at all, or whether it had been something else. Something the people in the polo shirts had been quietly walking around behind for a long time. And whether, when they had taken it from our loading bay, they had done it because they did not want anyone else to walk around behind it. I set the spine down on the bench. I washed my hands. I went home. My wife had made dinner. My son told me about a game he had played at recess. My older daughter set the table. My younger daughter, the one who has only ever known the new name, sat in her chair and waited to be helped with her food. I helped her. I cut her chicken into small pieces. I poured her milk. I kissed the top of her head. I am still here. The people I left behind to keep them are not. The recording is still being made. I do not know whose name is being read tonight. I know only that it has not been mine, yet, a second time, and that every evening I sit down to dinner with my family, and I eat my food, and I listen very carefully to the small, soft sounds in the quiet between sentences. And I do not hear anything. And I'm grateful. And I'm ashamed. And I keep eating.